My hands trembled when I shook the pill bottle and heard nothing but hollow silence. It was the sound of betrayal. For a moment, I thought I had misplaced the tablets. Maybe left them by the sink. Maybe knocked them off the nightstand. But as I searched every drawer, every shelf, a cold realization spread through me like a slow storm. My medicine wasn't lost. It was taken. And when I looked out the window at the gleaming silver car parked proudly in the driveway, I knew exactly where my lifeline had gone. I stood frozen, one hand gripping the empty bottle, the other pressed against the windowsill as my son strutted outside, polishing the hood with a rag as if it were a crown jewel. His smile wasn't the smile of a man proud of his hard work. It was the grin of someone who thought he'd outsmarted the world. And his own father. I whispered his name, hoping my voice might wake him from whatever madness had taken root, but he didn't even glance back. The reflection in the car's metal showed only arrogance, not recognition. The truth pressed down on me, heavier than the weight in my chest that those pills were meant to ease. That money wasn't luxury. It wasn't for vacations or hobbies or anything frivolous. It was survival. Months of careful savings, put aside to keep my heart beating, to give me just a few more years. And he had taken it, stripped me of breath, so he could sit behind a wheel and feel important. I wanted to storm out, demand an answer, shake him until the truth fell out of his mouth like loose change. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped back from the window, lowered myself into the old armchair that creaked under my weight, and stared at the empty bottle in my hand. My throat was tight, but no tears came. There was only silence, and in that silence, a question echoed louder than any shout. How could my own son decide a car was worth more than his father's life? The engine roared to life outside, loud and proud, filling the air with a sound that felt like mockery. He drove off in that shiny machine, leaving me in the dim light of the living room, clutching plastic that once rattled with hope. I sat there, listening to the echo of the motor fade, and in that fading sound, I realized something more terrifying than the empty bottle. If he was capable of this, what else was he hiding from me? And so, as the night closed in and the house grew darker, I knew the bottle was only the beginning of what I was about to discover. I confronted him that evening, my voice low, steady, almost pleading, but his eyes carried no remorse. "It's just money, Dad," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter as if the house were his and not mine. "You don't need those pills. You're strong enough without them." His words cut deeper than any blade. Strong enough? I could feel the heaviness in my chest even as he spoke. Those pills weren't a choice. They were the thin line between me standing and me collapsing. And yet, he had looked me in the face and decided my survival was optional. I wanted to believe I had misheard him, that maybe he had a plan to replace what he took, that this was a mistake. But when his phone buzzed and he smirked at the message flashing on the screen, plans with friends, celebrations of his new purchase, I knew there was no mistake. He had chosen his new life, his shiny car, over the father who raised him. I introduced myself to you once before, but let me remind you who I am, because sometimes people forget the weight behind a name. I am Walter Harris, 78 years old, retired machinist, widower, and father of one. My hands carry the scars of decades of turning bolts and lifting steel, of working through winters so cold the sweat froze on my back. I never asked for luxury. I asked for fairness. I asked for the dignity of being remembered. And standing in that kitchen, hearing my son dismiss my very breath as if it were an inconvenience, I felt more invisible than ever. I thought of his childhood, how I patched his torn shoes with glue when I couldn't afford new ones, how I skipped meals so he could have seconds at dinner, how I sold my wedding band the year he needed money for college books. Every sacrifice etched into me now rose like ghosts, crowding the room, watching silently as their worth was denied by the very boy they were meant for. The refrigerator hummed behind us, the only sound in the house. I placed the empty pill bottle on the table between us. That money was for my medicine, I said, my voice breaking but my stare unflinching. It was my life you spent. He shifted uncomfortably, but not from guilt, only from annoyance. You'll be fine, he muttered, grabbing his keys. You worry too much. And with that, he walked out, leaving me with silence and the rattle of the bottle rolling onto the floor. I bent down slowly, picked it up, and held it tight in my palm. For years, I thought the greatest fear of growing old was weakness. But in that moment, I understood the truth. The greatest fear is realizing the ones you love most see your life as dispensable. What I didn't know then was that his betrayal was only the surface. Something much darker was waiting for me, just beneath the cracks of his lies. The night after he left, I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The silence felt alive, pressing against my chest harder than any illness ever had. My name is Walter Harris, and I am 78 years old. Once, I was a machinist who worked 12-hour shifts surrounded by sparks, grease, and the roar of engines. For 4 decades, I gave every ounce of strength to build a steady life. Not for myself, but for my boy. Now here I was, an old man clutching an empty bottle, wondering if every sacrifice had been wasted. I remembered the mornings when I walked through snow so deep it reached my knees, just to punch in at the factory. I remembered the blisters on my palms from overtime hours I didn't have to take but did, because a child needed shoes, because a boy needed books, because a growing son needed more than his father's excuses. I thought of the winter I sold the only suit I owned to pay for his school trip so he wouldn't be the kid left behind. He had looked up at me then with eyes so full of gratitude. What happened to that boy? Where had he gone? I traced the lines of my calloused hands under the yellow light, each scar a reminder of days I'd chosen his comfort over mine. I was never rich, but I was rich in hope. That one day he would grow into a man who respected the life given to him. But hope, I've learned, is fragile. It shatters quickly when met with arrogance. That new car outside was more than metal and paint. It was a mirror, reflecting the truth I hadn't wanted to face. He wasn't just careless with money. He was careless with me. And as much as it hurt, the deeper wound was knowing he could justify it to himself. To him, I was no longer the father who stayed up all night fixing his broken toys, or the man who sat at his bedside when fever shook his small body. To him, I was just an old man taking pills, a burden to be managed. I leaned back in my chair and let the memories wash over me, each one heavier than the last. His laughter as a child, his first bicycle ride, the promise he once made to take care of me when I grew old. Those promises now felt like smoke, scattered and gone. The bottle in my hand rattled softly when I shook it, a cruel reminder of emptiness, empty of medicine, empty of trust. I looked toward the door, where the faint outline of the driveway light spilled through the curtain. That car would not keep shining forever. Paint fades, engines break, but the truth remains. And somewhere in the silence of that long night, I knew. I had to uncover what else he had taken from me. Morning crept in through the curtains, pale and gray, carrying with it the weight of another day I hadn't asked for. I shuffled to the window, my joints stiff, and stared at the driveway where his new car sat gleaming in the early light. It looked like a trophy, a monument to betrayal, and every shine of its polished surface reminded me that my medicine, my lifeline, was locked beneath its hood. I gripped the curtain tighter, my nails digging into the fabric, as if holding on to something tangible might steady the storm inside me. I tried to busy myself with routine, making coffee, buttering toast, but every motion felt hollow. The taste of bitterness lingered stronger than the coffee itself. As I sat down, a memory came uninvited. My son at 12 years old, grinning ear to ear when I brought home his first baseball glove. I had skipped 3 meals that week to afford it, but the joy in his eyes had made the hunger worthwhile. Now, years later, I was the one left hungry. Not for food, but for respect, for recognition that my life still mattered. The day stretched slowly, and in the silence, I started noticing little details I'd ignored before. Receipts crumpled in the trash that weren't mine. The faint smell of gasoline clinging to his jacket when he tossed it carelessly over a chair. The way his laughter outside with friends grew louder whenever I retreated into the shadows of the house. He was building a life of appearances, and I was no longer a part of it. I wasn't a father in his eyes anymore. I was an obstacle. That evening, when he returned, I stood at the kitchen doorway, watching him drop his car keys on the counter as if he owned the place. "You came in late," I said quietly. He shrugged, not even glancing at me. "I was out celebrating. Don't worry about it." My throat tightened, words pressing against my chest, but I swallowed them. Instead, I watched the way he carried himself, confident, untouchable, as though he believed he had finally escaped the shadow of the old man who raised him. But shadows have a way of stretching, of following you where you least expect. As he walked upstairs, whistling without a care, I noticed something fall from his pocket, a folded slip of paper half hidden by the rug. I picked it up after he vanished into his room. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It wasn't just a receipt. It was a bank statement, a withdrawal so large it made my heart pound louder than any engine. The car was only part of it. There was more, much more. I sank into the armchair, clutching the paper, my chest tightening not just from age or sickness, but from a realization sharp as glass. The car was only the beginning. My son had been reaching deeper into my life than I had ever imagined, and I was only just starting to see how far his hand had gone. The paper shook in my hand as though it carried its own pulse. I laid it flat on the table, smoothing the creases with my palm, and the numbers glared up at me like a cruel confession. It wasn't just a few $100s. It wasn't even a few thousand. My son had been siphoning money steadily, in sums large enough to choke a man who had lived his whole life counting every penny. I traced the date, the signature, the account that bore my name. My medicine fund was only the tip of the iceberg. He had been digging into the very core of my survival. I rose slowly and walked to the window again, the driveway light catching the polished chrome of that car. Neighbors passed, some stopping to admire it, waving to him with smiles when he pulled in as though he were some kind of success story. None of them knew the truth, that every shine of that paint was paid for with years of my sweat, with nights I worked overtime while my bones screamed for rest, with coins I tucked away from my pension checks because I knew someday my health would falter. And now, the man I once carried on my shoulders had taken it all to carry himself a little higher in the eyes of strangers. I sat back down, the paper still trembling between my fingers, and thought of my wife. She had been the cautious one, the saver, the one who reminded me to keep an envelope tucked away for emergencies. After she passed, I promised her memory that I'd protect that money, that it would always be there for medicine, for care, for the fragile days that old age brings. I had kept that promise faithfully, until the one person who should have honored it too decided a car was worth more than my promise to her. When he came home later that night, laughter still clinging to him like cologne, I stayed seated in the armchair. He tossed his jacket down, humming some tune I didn't recognize. My eyes followed him, not with anger, but with something colder. He noticed the paper on the table, paused for a second, then smirked. "You found it," he said, as though I had stumbled on a harmless secret. "Don't look at me like that, Dad. I just needed it more than you did." I didn't answer. Words felt too small against the weight of what I held in my hand. He shrugged, pocketed his phone, and walked upstairs without another word, as though the matter was closed. The silence that followed was unbearable. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was contempt. He believed I was too weak, too dependent, too afraid to fight back. I sat in that silence long after he shut his door, gripping the statement until my knuckles whitened. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. My son thought the car was his victory. He thought the money was his triumph, but he didn't know what I was about to uncover next. Sleep would not come that night. I sat at the table with the lamp burning low. The bank statement spread out like a wound I couldn't close. The numbers blurred and sharpened with every blink, mocking me with proof that my son hadn't just taken money. He had taken faith. Around midnight, I heard him laughing upstairs on the phone, boasting about his new car, about finally living like he deserved. His voice carried through the thin walls, every word a dagger. I pressed my fist against my chest, not from illness this time, but from the hollow ache of humiliation. By morning, the ache had hardened into something sharper. I watched him stroll into the kitchen, hair slicked back, car keys spinning around his finger like a toy. "Morning, Dad," he said casually, opening the fridge. He didn't notice the paper still lying on the table. Or maybe he didn't care. He pulled out a bottle of juice, drank straight from it, then glanced at me. "Don't look so worried. You've lived long enough. Let me enjoy life a little." The words stung worse than the emptiness of the pill bottle. To him, my life was already written in the past tense. I said nothing, but my silence wasn't surrender. While he strutted out the door, bragging on the phone to another friend about his money, I grabbed my coat and stepped into the crisp air. The streets felt colder that day, not just from the weather, but from the weight pressing on me. I walked to the corner store, the one where I'd spent years buying groceries with careful hands, always counting every coin. The owner, an old neighbor named Harold, saw me and frowned. "Walter, you don't look well," he said gently. I shook my head. "It's not sickness this time, Harold. It's something worse." I didn't explain further, but his worried look stayed with me as I headed back home. The truth was clawing at me, louder now than any engine or laughter. My son hadn't stopped at my medicine. He was draining me dry, and I had no idea how long it had been happening. Every receipt, every missing dollar, every smug grin. It all told me there was more hidden beneath the surface. I had raised him to believe in honesty, in hard work, in dignity. But somewhere along the line, he had traded all that for greed. That evening, I sat again at the table, the paper between my fingers, the silence pressing heavy. My chest tightened with a thought I could no longer ignore. If he was willing to steal my medicine money for a car, what else had he already taken? The question lingered in the air like a shadow, and I knew I couldn't rest until I found the answer. The next morning, I forced myself to move slower than usual, letting him leave first. His laughter trailed out the door along with the squeal of tires, the sound of that car roaring down the street like a beast fed with my lifeblood. When the house finally fell into silence, I sat at the table staring at the crumpled bank statement until the edges blurred. My heart whispered that this was bigger than one reckless purchase. My son had opened a door of deceit, and I was only standing on the threshold. I began searching. Old drawers, folders in the cabinet, the metal box beneath my bed where I'd always kept important things. What I found made my stomach knot. Envelopes missing, signatures I didn't remember giving, bank slips that bore my name but not my handwriting. I touched the ink with trembling fingers, as though feeling the weight of the pen strokes could tell me the truth. My son's hand had been here. He had been moving money bit by bit, quiet as a thief who knows his victim is too tired to shout. Each paper I unfolded felt like another betrayal stacked on top of the last. I remembered the way he used to hand me his school report cards, proud and smiling, waiting for me to nod and tell him he'd done well. Now I imagined him handing these same forged slips to a banker with the same smile, except this time he wasn't waiting for my approval. He was counting on my silence. When he returned that evening, he tossed his jacket over the chair and hummed, the picture of a man without a care. I kept the papers hidden under a stack of old magazines, my eyes following him without a word. He thought I was weak, too old, too slow to piece anything together. He thought I would stay quiet, nod, and let him enjoy his little victories. But the silence in the room wasn't weakness. It was gathering strength. After he went upstairs, I pulled the papers out again and spread them across the table. My pulse quickened as the pattern revealed itself. He had taken more than I had dared imagine. This wasn't a one-time betrayal. It was a trail. A history of theft carved in ink and signatures. I leaned back, clutching my chest, not from sickness, but from the weight of the realization. The car was nothing more than a mask. Behind it, my son had been carving away at the very foundation of my life. And yet, as devastating as it felt, something inside me stirred. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just afraid. I was alert. Because if these papers had found their way into my hands tonight, maybe tomorrow I'd discover something even darker. The following day, I walked slower than usual. Not because my body demanded it, but because my mind was heavy with questions I could no longer bury. I needed someone I could trust, someone who would see me as more than an old man fumbling through papers. That's when I stopped at the fence of my neighbor, Carl. He was leaning on his rake, the way he always did when he wanted to pretend he was still strong enough to manage his yard. He'd been a mechanic most of his life, and his eyes had that sharpness of a man who still noticed the small things. "Walter," he said, tilting his head, "I've been meaning to ask, did your boy buy a new car recently?" My heart stuttered. The question came too naturally, like it had been waiting on his tongue. I nodded slowly. "Yes, just last week." Carl sighed, pushing his rake aside. "I saw him at the bank before that. He was in there for a long time. Left with a folder tucked under his arm and a grin on his face like he'd just struck gold." The words sank deep, heavier than the crisp autumn air around us. My suspicion was no longer just mine. It had been witnessed, confirmed by eyes that had no reason to lie. I asked carefully, "Did you happen to see which teller helped him?" Carl scratched his chin. "Young woman with glasses. She looked a bit uneasy, kept glancing at him like something wasn't right." He paused. "Walter, you might want to look into it. I don't know what he's up to, but it didn't look like routine business." I thanked him, though the words caught in my throat. As I walked back inside, the silence of my house seemed louder than ever. The betrayal was growing, shaping itself into something larger than I wanted to face. I sat down with the crumpled statements again, my mind circling Carl's words. My son hadn't just taken my medicine money. He had been inside the bank. Moving pieces I hadn't even known were on the board. That night, when he returned, his laughter filled the driveway again, echoing against the walls. But I couldn't look out the window this time. I sat in the darkened living room, gripping the edge of my chair, listening to the sound of his keys jingling like chains. He had no idea, I knew. No idea that the silence he mistook for weakness was turning into a weapon. Because Carl's warning had changed everything. If my son thought he had buried his secrets deep enough, he was wrong. The truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface, and I was ready to start digging. That night I barely closed my eyes. Sleep would come in broken pieces, chased away by the same question circling in my mind. How far had he gone? The bank statement on the table glared at me. Carl's words rang in my ears, and the silence of the house pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. By dawn, I knew I couldn't rest until I found out the whole truth. I went to the drawer where I kept old documents, insurance forms, pension letters, the savings account I had guarded like a secret promise to myself. My fingers traced each envelope, one by one, until I found gaps where papers should have been. Entire folders were thinner than I remembered. My heart began to pound, not with the weakness of illness, but with a sharper rhythm, like the sound of warning bells. He had been here. He had touched these papers, signed where he had no right to sign, moved what he had no right to move. I carried the stack to the kitchen table, spreading them out under the dim glow of the lamp. Signatures, withdrawals, transfers. Some looked like mine, but the strokes were wrong, the pressure uneven. I knew my own hand, steady, careful, shaped by years of handling machinery. These were forged, bold and hurried, as if written by someone who believed no one would ever question them. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. each second hammering into me the truth I didn't want to face. My son hadn't just stolen once. He had been building a pattern, quietly draining me like a man digging a well in secret. The medicine money was only the spark that set my eyes on the truth. But beneath that spark was a fire, growing all along while I trusted him. When the door finally creaked open and his footsteps echoed in the hallway, I stuffed the papers back into the drawer and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. He entered, humming, tossing his keys onto the counter with that careless confidence that had begun to feel like mockery. He didn't notice my eyes following him, or maybe he didn't care. He thought I was still the quiet father who wouldn't fight back. But he was wrong. I wasn't silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was watching. That night, as he laughed upstairs on the phone, I sat in the dark holding a pen and a notebook, writing down every detail, every date, every receipt. My hand trembled, but not from fear, from determination. He thought he had covered his tracks, but the cracks in his lies were already showing, and I was going to follow them until the whole truth came to light. By the time morning came, my kitchen table looked less like a place for breakfast and more like an investigation desk. Papers spread across every inch, envelopes stacked in uneven piles, the notebook filling with my scribbles. My eyes burned from the long night, but I couldn't stop. Every page I turned revealed another cut into my life, another withdrawal, another signature that wasn't mine. He had been at this for longer than I dared to admit. The medicine money was only the latest blow. He had been carving into me for years. I found an envelope I didn't remember opening before. Inside was a statement from the insurance company, showing a transfer I had never authorized. The amount was large enough to steal my breath, money that had been meant for emergencies, money my late wife and I had put aside when she was still alive. I remembered her hands guiding mine as we filled out those forms together, her voice telling me, "Promise me this will be safe for when you need it most." My throat tightened. She had trusted me to guard it, and I had, until my own son betrayed us both. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of it all pressed down. My son hadn't just taken money. He had taken the years of sacrifice that money represented. He had taken the safety net his mother left behind. He had taken the last piece of dignity I thought I could count on. And worst of all, he had taken it without hesitation, without apology, as if my survival was negotiable. When he came downstairs that afternoon, he was dressed sharp, hair combed, his jacket pressed as though he were on his way to a meeting. He stopped when he saw the table, the papers, the notebook open with my handwriting. His smile faltered for just a second before returning. "Going through old junk, Dad?" he asked lightly. I looked at him, my jaw tight, my hand resting over the insurance envelope. "Not junk," I said. "Memories." His eyes flicked to the paper under my hand, then back to me. "You worry too much," he muttered, grabbing his keys again. I watched him walk out the door, his car engine roaring to life a moment later. He thought I was too tired, too broken to do anything with what I had found, but he didn't know that every paper I held, every line I read, was sharpening me. He didn't know that the truth he buried so carelessly was about to become the very thing that would undo him. And as the sound of the engine faded into the distance, I knew this was no longer just about stolen money. It was about stolen years, stolen promises, and it was time I started taking them back. That evening, when the house had grown still and the shadows deepened across the walls, I sat alone with the papers spread before me. My chest ached, not from the illness that demanded those pills, but from something heavier, a wound that medicine couldn't touch. I replayed his words in my mind, the casual way he dismissed my life as if it were nothing but loose change he could pocket. It wasn't the car. It wasn't even the money. It was the contempt. My own son looked at me and saw a man past his use, a father reduced to a burden. The sound of his footsteps upstairs drifted faintly through the ceiling. He was pacing, laughing into his phone again, boasting about his new purchase, talking about weekend trips, restaurants, nights out. Every word felt like another stone laid on my chest. I pressed my hand against the table, grounding myself, because anger threatened to pull me apart. But I didn't shout. I didn't storm up those stairs. Instead, I breathed slow and steady, letting the silence wrap around me. Because silence, I realized, could be louder than rage. My mind wandered back to the years when he was small, when he would run through the door with scraped knees and tears streaming down his face. Back then, I was the one who lifted him, patched him up, told him the world wasn't as cruel as it seemed. I believed him when he said, "I'll take care of you when you're old." Dad. Those promises echoed now, twisted and hollow, making the betrayal burn deeper. How did that boy become this man, who could watch me clutch an empty pill bottle and feel no shame? I closed the notebook where I had been recording every discovery and stared at the wall. The silence between us had become a wall higher than any I had faced before. And yet, I felt something stirring beneath the hurt, a resolve I hadn't expected. I would not beg. I would not crumble. I had spent a lifetime building, providing, surviving storms greater than this. And if he thought I would fade quietly into the night, he didn't know me at all. Upstairs, his laughter spiked louder, carefree and arrogant. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling, and let the sound fuel me. He thought the story was over, that he had won. But he didn't realize this was only the beginning, because the next time I looked him in the eye, I wouldn't be the father he thought was too weak to fight back. I would be the man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to uncover. The next morning I left the house before dawn, my breath fogging in the cold air, my steps slower than they used to be but steady with purpose. I carried a small folder under my arm, the very papers he thought I would never notice, the signatures he assumed would vanish into the shuffle of an old man's life. I wasn't going to confront him yet. That would come later. First, I needed to arm myself with something stronger than suspicion. I needed the truth written in ink that no arrogance could erase. I went to the office of an old friend, Mr. Clayton, a retired union steward who now spent his mornings at a desk helping men like me sort out pensions, wills, and the bureaucratic knots life leaves behind. His hair had gone fully white, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "Walter," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you look like a man carrying more than you should." I laid the folder down and slid it toward him. "Tell me if I'm crazy," I whispered. He put on his glasses, opened the papers, and his brow furrowed almost immediately. "These signatures," he muttered, running his finger along the page. "They don't match. Not your hand, Walter. This is someone else trying to be you." My stomach sank even though I had already known it. Hearing it confirmed out loud was like being struck twice. "He's been using my name," I said quietly. Clayton nodded. "And not just once. This is a pattern. Withdrawals, transfers, all tied back to your accounts. If you hadn't caught this, it would have gone on until nothing was left." I sat there, hands trembling. The smell of old coffee in the air, the sound of his pen scratching as he jotted down notes. My friend leaned closer. "Walter, you have enough here to open a case, but I know this isn't just about money. This is about your son." I swallowed hard. "Yes, about my son, about the boy I raised with every ounce of strength I had, who now looks at me as if I'm just a wall in his way." Clayton's voice softened. "Then you need to decide. Do you want to confront him alone, or do you want to make it official?" His words lingered in the quiet of that small office. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight shift ever so slightly from my chest. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't voiceless. The papers I held were more than proof of theft. They were the keys to something my son never expected. The truth standing against him. As I left the office and stepped back into the cold morning, the folder tucked under my arm felt heavier but also sharper, like a weapon I had never thought I'd have to wield. And as the sun rose over the street, I realized my silence was over. The time for pretending not to see had passed. The next move was mine, and he would never see it coming. That evening I returned home before he did. The house was dim, the kind of dim that makes silence louder. I sat at the table with my folder beside me, untouched, as though its weight alone was enough to anchor me. When the sound of his car pulled into the driveway, my pulse quickened, not with fear, but with resolve. He came in whistling, keys jangling, the scent of cologne trailing him like a parade. He didn't even look my way at first. To him, I was furniture, background. A shadow too weak to matter. "Long day, Dad?" he asked with that careless grin as he tossed his jacket over the chair. I watched him, saying nothing, and let the silence stretch. He frowned slightly, as though puzzled by my stillness. "What's with you?" he muttered, reaching for a glass. I waited until he filled it, until he lifted it halfway to his lips, before I spoke. "Do you know what happens to liars?" My voice was calm, steady. His hand froze mid-air, glass trembling just slightly. He tried to laugh it off. "What are you talking about?" But his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. I leaned back in my chair, my gaze locked on him. And in that moment, I realized silence could cut sharper than any shout. I didn't accuse him outright. I didn't need to. I let the papers in the folder stay hidden, my knowledge concealed behind a mask of weary patience. Every word he spoke became another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin of his lies. He started rambling, boasting about his plans, about how the car was just the beginning. Trips he'd take, investments he'd make, a new life he was already sketching in his head. His voice grew louder, more confident, as if he believed speaking dreams out loud would make them real. I nodded at the right times, pretended disinterest, even allowed a faint smile when he thought he'd impressed me. But inside, I was writing it all down. Every boast, every careless admission, every thread that tied back to the truth I already held. He thought I was blind. He thought I was deaf. He thought I was too old to understand the difference between arrogance and success. But I was listening closer than I ever had before. Every laugh, every slip of the tongue was another step he took deeper into the trap he was building for himself. And the best part? He didn't even know I was watching. He didn't know the man he thought too fragile had just decided to stop being silent. When he finally went upstairs, his laughter echoing down the hall, I opened the notebook again and wrote down his words line by line. His future was already inked on those pages, and soon he would discover the cost of underestimating the father who raised him. The days that followed became a quiet ritual. Each morning I gathered the papers. Each evening I added to my notebook. His arrogance fed me evidence, his pride gave me ammunition. But I knew I couldn't stand alone. A man's word can be dismissed, but witnesses carve the truth into stone. So I started reaching out, carefully, to those who had seen pieces of my life unfold. First was Carl, my neighbor. He'd seen me leave every Thursday to pay bills, to deposit checks, to guard my savings like a soldier guarding a post. When I asked if he'd be willing to speak on my behalf, if it ever came to it, he didn't hesitate. "Walter," he said, his hand firm on my shoulder, "I've watched you all these years. If your son's been dipping into what you earned, then he's not just betraying you, he's betraying all of us who know what honest work looks like." Next was Mrs. Hughes from the pharmacy. For years, she had seen me carefully count my medicine, week after week. When I mentioned the missing funds, her eyes widened with recognition. "That explains why the payments suddenly stopped," she whispered. "I thought it was a clerical error. Walter, if you need me to confirm you've always been faithful with your accounts, I will. Everyone here knows you." Even Mr. Patel at the corner store remembered the envelope I handed him to drop at the bank once, years ago, when my legs were too tired to make the walk. He told me how he'd seen my son at the bank recently, loud and brash, nothing like the quiet man who had once trusted him with a week's wages. "It didn't sit right with me," he admitted. "Now I understand why." I listened to them. Each story, like another brick in a wall I hadn't realized I was building. They remembered me not as a frail old man, but as someone who had lived with dignity, with patience, with responsibility. And in their memories, my son's actions grew sharper, more damning, painted in contrast to the man I had tried to be. At night, I returned home to the sound of his laughter upstairs, the muffled music, the occasional rev of the car engine outside. He thought he was untouchable, too clever to be caught, too far ahead for me to keep up. But he didn't know I was no longer standing alone. The truth was gathering, piece by piece, in the hands of people who had seen me when he thought no one was watching. As I closed my notebook that night, I felt the weight of betrayal pressing against me still. But this time, there was something stronger beneath it. A current of quiet strength, built not from anger, but from resolve. My son believed he had silenced me. But soon, the voices of others would rise beside mine, and he would have no place left to hide. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I sat in the living room with only the hum of the old refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock to keep me company. The papers were stacked neatly now, the notebook filled with details I could never forget. But it wasn't the evidence that weighed on me most. It was the reflection staring back at me from the darkened window. An old man, tired, lines etched deep into his face, eyes heavy not from age but from disappointment. For years I had told myself that silence was strength, that endurance was love. But in that moment, I asked myself the question I had been too afraid to say out loud. Was my silence the reason he thought he could steal from me? I leaned back in the chair, my chest rising and falling with the effort of thought. The memories flooded in again, his small hand holding mine on the walk to school. The way he once said I was his hero. The countless times I told him that honesty mattered more than anything else. And yet, here we were, with forged signatures and stolen money standing between us like a wall I hadn't seen being built until it was too high to climb. Maybe it wasn't just his greed that had brought us here. Maybe it was my refusal to show him that even fathers have limits. I pressed my palms against my knees and closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I let the anger settle, and what replaced it was something quieter, heavier. Acceptance. Not of defeat, but of the truth. I couldn't change the choices he had made. I couldn't rewrite the past. But I could decide how this story would end. And I knew then that it wouldn't end with me in silence, waiting for him to grow a conscience he clearly didn't want to find. Upstairs, I heard him moving, his voice carrying through the floorboards, careless and loud, like a man who thought the world belonged to him. I listened to the muffled sound, and instead of breaking me, it steadied me. His arrogance was my clarity. His contempt was my resolve. The father he thought was too weak to fight back had finally reached the edge. And once a man has nothing left to lose, he becomes someone his betrayers never expect. When the house finally stilled, I sat with the quiet and whispered to myself, no more. Tomorrow, I would take the first step toward showing him that even the weakest-looking wall can hide steel within it. And when he saw it, he would understand the silence he had mistaken for surrender was the very thing preparing me to rise. The next day, the air in the house felt heavier, as though it carried the weight of everything unspoken. He came down the stairs whistling, car keys dangling from his hand, the sound sharp and careless. He poured himself coffee, never asking if I wanted a cup, never glancing at the folder I had set on the table. For a moment, I let him believe the world was still his stage. Then I slid the folder across the table, the papers inside rustling like a storm waiting to break. "What's this?" he asked, raising an eyebrow, that same smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I kept my eyes steady on him. "You tell me." He opened the folder, pulled out the first page, and for the first time in weeks, I saw his confidence falter. The smirk slipped. His jaw tightened and his eyes flicked up to mine, searching for the weakness he had always relied on. But I didn't flinch. "You've been busy," he muttered, setting the papers down too quickly, as if touching them burned his hands. "You shouldn't dig into things you don't understand, Dad. It'll only make things worse." His voice tried to sound calm, but underneath it was a tremor, the sound of a man caught in his own trap. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "Worse for who?" He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. You think you're going to scare me with this? You don't know how to handle money. You never did. I'm just cleaning up what you couldn't manage." His words stung, but they no longer cut the way they once did. I had already seen the proof. Every line of ink, every forged signature, every missing dollar. It was all here. I didn't need his confession. His silence as he stared at the pages was confession enough. I tapped the folder with my finger, slow and deliberate. "This isn't about money. This is about respect, and you've taken the last piece of it from me." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or shame. But it was buried quickly under arrogance. He shoved the folder back toward me. "Do what you want, old man, but don't think for a second you can stand in my way." He stormed out, the slam of the door rattling the windows, the car engine roaring to life seconds later. I sat in the silence that followed, the folder still on the table, my hand resting on it like a promise. He thought I was bluffing. He thought I would fold the way I always had. But he didn't understand. The moment I laid those papers before him, the game had changed, and the next move was mine. That night he returned late, the sound of his car echoing through the driveway long before the door opened. I stayed seated in the armchair, the folder resting on my lap like a silent judge. His steps were uneven, heavy, as if the weight of our earlier confrontation had followed him out into the world and clung to his shoulders. When he saw me waiting, his smile was gone. He dropped his keys on the counter without a word, then finally spoke, his voice sharp. "You don't understand what you're doing, Dad. You're going to ruin everything." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch until he grew restless, shifting from one foot to the other like a boy caught in a lie. "Ruin what?" I asked finally, my voice calm. "Your car? Your nights out? Or the illusion that all this was yours to begin with?" His jaw clenched, and for the first time, I saw the crack in his arrogance. He wasn't untouchable. He was cornered. He sank into the chair opposite me, his hands covering his face for a moment before he spoke again. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I needed a way out. You don't know what it's like, trying to keep up. Trying to prove yourself." His voice shook, not with remorse, but with desperation. "I thought I'd replace the money before you noticed. I thought I could fix it." I watched him carefully. There it was. The plea, the justification, the excuses that spilled out when pride met reality. He wanted me to believe he was a victim of circumstance, that this wasn't greed, but necessity. But the folder in my lap told another story. "You didn't just take money," I said quietly. "You took trust. You took years of sacrifice and treated them like loose change. You looked at me, your own father, and decided I was worth less than a car." His eyes flashed with anger then, the fear melting into defiance. "You think you've got me trapped with your papers and notes? You can't survive without me, Dad. You need me more than I need you. Remember that." His voice rose with every word until the house seemed to vibrate with it, but I stayed still, my grip firm on the folder. He mistook my silence for weakness again, but this time, it wasn't weakness. It was the weight of truth pressing down on him. He stood abruptly, shoving his chair back, and stormed upstairs. The slam of his door echoed like thunder through the house. I sat in the stillness that followed, the ache in my chest, not from sickness, but from sorrow. He thought his outburst closed the matter, but he didn't understand. Desperation may excuse a mistake, but it cannot erase betrayal. And in the quiet that lingered, I knew his anger was only the beginning. The storm was still coming, and I would be ready. The days after his outburst were uneasy, filled with silences heavier than any argument. He walked through the house with a new stiffness in his shoulders, no longer whistling, no longer smirking. At night, I heard him pacing his room, making phone calls in hushed tones, his words sharp, urgent, almost panicked. I knew that fear had begun to gnaw at him. But he still didn't believe I would act. He still thought the old man sitting in the living room was too broken, too tired, too dependent to ever stand against him. But he was wrong. I had already taken the folder to a lawyer, an old friend of Clayton's who listened carefully as I laid everything on his desk. The forged signatures, the bank statements, the withdrawals. The man's eyes hardened as he leafed through the evidence. "This isn't just family trouble, Walter," he said. "This is fraud. Theft. You have enough here to bring it to light in court." His words rang in my ears all the way home. It wasn't just my suspicion anymore. It was fact, carved into law. When I returned, he was in the driveway, leaning against that car as if it were his throne. Neighbors passed and nodded at him, admiring the shine, the sound of the engine when he revved it for no reason other than pride. I stood at the window, watching, my heart aching not from envy, but from sorrow. They saw a young man successful, confident. They didn't see the father inside, clutching papers that proved the car was nothing but stolen dignity dressed in chrome. That evening, I sat him down at the kitchen table. For once, I spoke without hesitation. "I've taken everything to a lawyer." His head snapped toward me, eyes wide, mask of arrogance cracking into panic. "You wouldn't," he muttered. But I didn't flinch. "I already have." The silence stretched between us, sharp enough to cut. His hands curled into fists on the table, his jaw tight, his breath shallow. "You're going to humiliate me," he whispered, as though humiliation was worse than betrayal. I leaned forward. "You humiliated yourself the moment you decided a car was worth more than your father's life." He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. "If you go through with this, you'll destroy this family." My voice stayed steady. "Family is built on trust. You destroyed it the moment you stole from me." His eyes darted to the folder still in my hands, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. Not the fear of losing money, but the fear of being seen for who he truly was. When he stormed out that night, slamming the door behind him, the sound no longer rattled me. Instead, I sat in the quiet house and felt a strange kind of peace. The truth was no longer mine alone. It was written, documented, undeniable. He thought he could silence me with arrogance, but soon he would face the silence of a courtroom where every lie would echo back at him louder than he ever expected. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than I expected. The lawyer called me in, his voice firm but calm. "It's moving forward, Walter. The court will hear your case." I hung up the phone slowly, staring at the walls of my living room. The same walls that had witnessed laughter, birthdays, arguments, and now, betrayal. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what was about to happen. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just an old man surviving. I was a father demanding to be heard. Word must have reached him quickly, because that evening he came home like a storm. He didn't even shut the car door properly before barging inside, his face flushed, his voice sharp. "Do you know what you've done?" he spat, slamming his hand down on the table. "You've ruined me!" I looked at him, my voice steady. "No, you ruined yourself the day you chose greed over blood." He froze, his chest heaving. And for the first time I saw the panic plain in his eyes. The car, the money, the bravado, it all looked smaller now, fragile, as if it could vanish with a single gust of truth. The days that followed blurred into preparation. Meetings with the lawyer, gathering witnesses, collecting statements. Carl agreed to testify, Mrs. Hughes from the pharmacy, too. Even Mr. Patel, with his quiet dignity, said he'd stand beside me. Each voice was another piece of stone laid at my side, and together they built something stronger than my son's arrogance. A foundation of truth that couldn't be shaken. When the hearing finally came, the room felt colder than any winter I had endured. He arrived in a pressed suit, his hair slicked back, trying to look like the man he pretended to be. He didn't glance at me as he sat down, his jaw set, his lawyer whispering in his ear. I sat quietly, my folder resting on my lap, my eyes fixed on the judge. My chest rose and fell with the weight of decades, not just of work, but of sacrifice, of love poured into a son who had chosen contempt. The evidence was presented piece by piece: the forged signatures, the bank statements, the testimony of neighbors who had seen me faithfully guard what little I had. Each word chipped away at the mask he wore, until finally, even he couldn't meet my eyes. When I spoke, I didn't raise my voice. I told the truth the way I had lived my life, simply, steadily, with dignity. "I am not here for revenge," I said softly. "I am here because respect cannot be stolen. I am here because a man cannot be treated as disposable, not by strangers and certainly not by his own blood." The room fell silent when I finished. My son shifted in his chair, his confidence drained, his future uncertain. And as I walked out of that courtroom, the papers still tucked under my arm, I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever the outcome, the truth had finally been spoken. But deep down, I also knew this battle was not the end. The real test would come after, in the silence of the aftermath. The verdict came on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and the world feels heavier than it should. I sat in the courtroom, hands folded in my lap, my heart steady but my breath shallow. The judge's voice was even, deliberate, each word measured. "The evidence presented confirms a clear misuse of funds and forged documentation. The accounts in question will be restored to Mr. Walter Harris. The vehicle purchased under these circumstances will be repossessed." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. For a moment, I couldn't move. My son sat across the room, pale, his eyes fixed on the floor as though the wood grain could hide him from the truth. His lawyer whispered frantically, but he didn't respond. All the arrogance, all the pride, had drained out of him like air from a punctured tire. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. And that silence between us hurt more than any insult he had ever spoken. Neighbors congratulated me outside the courthouse, their words warm but unable to mend the hollow space inside my chest. Yes, justice had been served. Yes, the money would be returned. But no judgment could restore the years of trust that had been shattered, or the bond that had been ground down to dust under the weight of greed. As I walked home, the folder tucked under my arm, I felt both lighter and heavier all at once. The truth was mine, but so was the loneliness it carried. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, the world painted in muted gold. The air was quiet, almost too quiet, broken only by the faint chirp of crickets. I thought of my wife, of the promise I had kept to guard our savings, even when our own blood tried to steal it. I thought of the boy my son used to be, the one who once called me his hero, the one who swore he would look after me when I grew old. That boy was gone, replaced by a man I no longer recognized. The car was gone from the driveway, taken back by the bank before nightfall. The silence it left behind felt strange, less like victory, more like mourning. I looked at the empty space and wondered if it was a mirror of something deeper. The hollow left when love is replaced by betrayal. The papers were safe now, my account secured. But the ache remained. Some wounds money can never heal. As I rose from the chair and stepped inside, I caught sight of the folder still lying on the table. For the first time, I didn't feel anger when I looked at it. I felt resolve. Because though this chapter had closed, another was waiting. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the last time my son's choices would come back to my door.